right. Welcome, everyone, to our first and exciting event, the Oil and Gas Emissions Imperative, setting a new course to enable net zero emissions here at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator, brought to you by the Atlantic Council and the COP28 presidency. My name is Lee Beck. I'm the Senior Director for Europe and the Middle East at the Clean Air Task Force. We're a global climate organization focusing on overlooked solutions, and we're participating in programming here at COP28 to investigate the hard questions at the nexus of energy security, climate, and geopolitics. If you'd like to visit the Clean Air Task Force Pavilion in the Blue Zone, you can find us in B7, Building 88, on the first floor. So I'm really excited to welcome you to this really timely and really important panel, which really couldn't come in a better place, the Global Decarbonization Accelerator, and at a better time. So the future of fossil fuels has been highly contested in the run-up to this COP28 in particular. And the fault lines are, and I think I've heard it from a couple of panelists already, do we face down emissions or do we face down fossil fuels? And on what timeline? It is clear, I think, from the IPCC that the sooner we can reduce emissions, the better our chance at fending off the worst effects of climate change. This implies that we must face down emissions from fossil fuels faster than we might have to, or if we ever can, face down fossil fuels. And of course, there's massive questions about the equity of reducing supply globally. So we've had really tangible announcements here at COP28, massive funding, billions of funding for methane mitigation, following up on the global methane pledge 2 years ago from Glasgow. We're also progressing the carbon management challenge globally. And then, of course, the COP28 presidency launched the historic oil and gas charter. And multiple of our panelist companies actually committed to it, so we're excited to hear more about this. But I think the core question that we want to investigate is, how do we actually deliver asset transformation and implement the solutions? So what we're going to do today is we're first going to welcome Majid Safar, who's the CEO of Crescent Petroleum, for Keynote Remarks to frame out our discussion further. And then we're going to have a really high-level panel to get to the hard questions. Before I welcome you to the stage, just a few keynote remarks. The panel discussion is on the record. The session will be live-streamed and recorded and archived and can be found on the Atlantic Council and COP28 public pages. You, the audience online, and all of you are welcome to join us, to join the conversation at hashtag AC Energy and at AC Global Energy. I would also like to thank the staff at the Atlantic Council for making this happen and ensuring that we can have active debate and conversations around the world on the hardest questions. And with this, it's my real honor to welcome you to the stage, Majid, for your keynote remarks.
Thank you, Lee. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Pleasure to be here at COP28 in Dubai, and what an amazing event it's been so far already. The largest COP meeting, the most ambitious COP meeting, and as Lee said, we've already heard some amazing achievements and announcements. First and foremost, I think the announcement by our President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, on the first day for Altera, a new fund, $30 billion with the likes of BlackRock and Brookfield and others, with the goal to get to $250 billion for climate solutions, particularly targeting the global south. We've had the ambition of trebling renewable energy, yesterday trebling nuclear energy, and doubling energy efficiency. It's also been the most inclusive COP, I think, in terms of having the private sector as well as NGOs, not just the negotiating parties from the different governments, but also all different industries, and particularly all different sectors of the energy industry, who in some previous COPs were unfortunately excluded. And very importantly, bringing together all the countries of the world and making sure that the developing world, the global south, really are represented and were consulted in the framing of the agenda and not just invited to the meeting after the fact. So I think it's been extremely inspiring. It's been an honor for the UAE, and I think with the UAE's commitment, including $100 billion for investments in new energies around the world, I think it's been headquartered and hosted in absolutely the right place. To frame our discussion today, I'd like to step back and talk about energy before we get into oil and gas and the role and the dichotomy that Lee mentioned. And some of this is going to sound obvious, but I think it still needs saying, because I sometimes fear it's getting lost in the conversations around this meeting and in the public discourse at large. So what is energy? It's difficult to define. At school, it was kind of defined as the ability to do work. And you probably remember that from your science classes. But you can't see it. It's this abstract concept. And at the same time, it's the lifeblood of the economy and of our way of life around the world. But it's a bit like human health. If you have it, you can forget about it easily, too easily. Whereas if you lose it, you can think of nothing else. And we saw this last year with energy shocks in Europe and elsewhere. If we look back over the last few hundred years, it's really been the era of the modern energy system. And it has transformed human life on Earth and led to a flourishing that was unprecedented across so many areas. So we've had a trebling of average lifespan during that period. And that's been down to huge enhancements in food production, energy management. You know, the fact that this city can be 3 million plus and this country is 10 million plus is because of the modern energy system. The fact that you're all here, what the screen is made of, what your smartphones are made of. If we look at food production, in 1950, only 2 generations ago, 2/3 of the world were hungry or malnourished. And the world was only 2.5 billion. So we were struggling to feed 900 million people. And we're failing with the rest. Today, the world is 8 billion people. And less than 10% are actually malnourished. There's still work to be done, but that's an incredible achievement that over 7 billion people now are being adequately fed. And that is because of this modern energy system. And if we boil it down, a kilo of bread takes about 1/3 of a bottle of crude oil to get to you. If you look at all the inputs from the fertilizers and transportation and so on, a kilo of chicken is more like half a bottle. Kilo of seafood, those of you who like the seafood, that's a full bottle of crude oil. Because there's fishing to be done and so on. I think that's underappreciated. And then if we look at the health side, which has absolutely been key in human lifespans, and today is the health themed day here at the COP as well. Everything from the toothpaste you used this morning, to every medicine you've ever taken, to every vaccine we all took during COVID, all had glycol as a stabilizing agent. So the entire system of human life has depended on that modern energy system. And I say that because we still have within that a dichotomy. And for me, it's not fossil fuels versus renewables, which it's often boiled down to, because I think we're going to need more of all forms of energy, and I'll come to that through the transition. It's this imbalance between the global north and the global south. We have today 1 billion people in the OECD, the rich countries of the world, using more energy than the 7 billion people, the other 7 billion, if you like, in the developing countries. And it's those developed countries that are responsible for most of the stock of greenhouse gases that are up there. And yet, their own economies in the US and Europe have seen falling emissions over the last decades. And there are aging populations, post-industrial societies, less energy-intensive economic growth. It's the developing world, particularly Asia today and Africa tomorrow, where you have the rise in populations, in economic growth, and therefore in energy consumption and also in emissions growth. But it is, when you have today the average African using 1/10 of the average energy of an average European, or 1/20th of that of an average American, it is immoral, unworkable, and impractical to say you cannot expect the same standard of living that the West has come to enjoy. So how do we decarbonize this current energy system to meet the global climate objectives while we invest in the energy system of the future? And it is a transition. It's not like, unplugging a television station and replacing it with another. This is an infrastructure that has been built over decades. And actually, electricity is only 18% of total global energy demand. And renewables, which has been growing and important, and cost is coming down, although there are limits to how far the cost will come down, is only dealing with that part so far, the electricity part. So we still have big parts of the energy system that we need to address. We've had a rise of 1 degree in global temperatures, average temperatures, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the world has committed to capping a further rise of 1 degree or hopefully less in the Paris Agreement. So how do we do that? How do we achieve the energy trilemma of affordability, availability, and sustainability, bearing in mind that we still have 7 billion people in the developing world? If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which the UN set, if you are in the 1 billion, then the only one that matters to you is really climate action, because you can take for granted the others. But if you are in the 7 billion, then they all matter. Food, clean water, healthcare, education, good governance, conflict resolution, and so on. And none of them are possible, I would posit, without energy. So it is the quintessential requirement for achieving all of those development goals. Therefore, that's why I think it's very apt that here at COP28, achieving a just and equitable energy transition is one of the 4 pillars that the COP presidency has defined. Now, going to the energy mix that we have today, it is about 80% still fossil fuels, but within that mix, gas has been growing and replacing coal, and actually the coal to gas switch has been 100 times more effective at dropping emissions over the previous decade than all the electric cars in the world, and that's underappreciated. Renewables has been growing, but so far has been a complement rather than a replacement. And just last year managed to meet the growth in electricity demand, but far from meeting the growth in total energy demand. We still have China building 200 coal plants today, India increasing its coal capacity by 60% by the end of the decade, despite China also being the largest investor in renewables. And the reason is, when there's no solar or wind power, you need something to back it up, because storage is not commercially viable at the moment. To store the energy of 1 barrel of oil would take $200,000 worth of batteries and weighing many, many tons. So actually it's renewables backed up by either natural gas or nuclear power, which provide a combination of firm power that is the most sustainable today. And oil will still be needed. Aside from light transport, which is becoming electrified, we still have trucking, shipping, air transport to find solutions for, and it's much more challenging. But everything the transition relies upon is actually made of oil, from solar panels to the electric cars themselves, from their tires, the roads they run on, the interiors and so on, wind turbines. So we will still be needing it, but how we use it and how we produce it must change. So we in the oil and gas sector, just giving you our example, Crescent Petroleum, we've been over 50 years here headquartered in the UAE, active in the Middle East. We've transitioned from an oil company 50 years ago. We're now 85% natural gas. We've brought down our carbon intensity to 6 kilos per kilogram of CO2. We are now we've made the commitment to the global decarbonization accelerator, as well as the OGCI zero methane commitment. And over 7 years, we reduced those methane emissions to 0.12% of production and offset the remainder with UN certified carbon credits supporting wind power in China and Mongolia and places like that to achieve carbon neutrality across our production 2 years ago, and we've maintained that since. And I put that out as just an example. But the gas we produce actually displaces diesel for power generation in the Middle East and avoids more than 5 million tons of CO2 annually, which is actually more than all the Tesla cars on the planet. So the role of natural gas in the transition is also fundamental. Finally, the Middle East, I think, is going to be where a lot of these technologies are getting proven up, whether it's the big investments being made with green hydrogen. We already have the lowest cost solar energy on the planet. There's a great exhibition of it right behind us here in this center. So I think it's the fulcrum of where a lot of these energy questions are going to be answered. And so it's an exciting time to be here, to have you all at COP. I leave you with the thought that we will still be needing oil and gas through the transition, and a failure to invest in it has unfortunately led to failure across all three legs of the energy trilemma. And we saw that last year. We had energy price spikes, supply shocks, and more burning of coal in the developing world, and therefore worse for the emissions and the climate. So bear in mind, how do we decarbonize the current system while we build the new system, and always keeping in mind the needs of the billion people around the world who still have no electricity, and the 2.5 billion people around the world who still don't have a clean cooking solution. Keep that in mind, because that's fundamental for the human question as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really fantastic opening remarks that really put a finer point on the difficulties of the current dichotomy, as you mentioned. I want to highlight energy access as the building block for development and climate action, and the first line of defense for many of emerging markets and developing countries, which are already feeling the impacts of climate change at a disproportionate rate. I think we're going to transition to our panel now, so really exciting. I'd like to ask the panelists to come on the stage. And I'm really honored to welcome, to my left, I have Allison Anderson-Book, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of Baker Hughes, followed by Vijay Swarup, who's the Director of Technology at Exxon, Adam Szyminski, Senior Advisor at CapSARC, and last but not least, Vamzila, Executive Director at the Center for Carbon Transition at JP Morgan. But actually, I want to start with a question for all of you. Raise your hand if you think we should be phasing out fossil fuels. Okay. Raise your hand if you think we should be phasing down emissions. Okay, nobody raised their hand twice. But no hand raising here, did you? Well, from Allison? Yeah, you raise your hand. For which one? Okay, I mean, just double checking, right? All right, so I think audience is pretty clear here. So let's go right into a conversation, right? And Vijay, I want to start with you. Exxon joined the Oil and Gas Charter, which covers 40% of global oil and gas production. net zero commitment to net zero by 2050. Also, incredible participation, not just from IOCs, but also majority NOCs, which is really where future oil and gas production will move. Tell us a little bit about, what Exxon is doing. How much are you investing? Which solutions are you betting on?
Well, first off, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Thank you all. There's a lot going on here, and really appreciate you all taking time out to be part of the conversation. That was an amazing keynote. Covered an incredible number of topics in a short period of time. And I think it's an important discussion, and I'll answer your question in just 1 minute. It is so important that we get the right question. We're engineers, and engineers spend a lot of time defining the problem before you jump to answering and solving. And so what you posed to the audience was, what is the problem? That's what you were asking. Now, you gave it as a two-part multiple choice. I would postulate there's more choices than just those two. But let's remember the absolute answer, which is we've got to meet demand. And so if you look at the oil and gas charter, what is it really saying? It's saying we have to meet demand while reducing emissions. And the charter then gets into how do you do that? And one of the cornerstone points of that charter is you have to do that through collaboration. You have to do that through best practice transfer. You have to do that through sharing of technology. And that's part of the way you close the North-South divide, is you share best practices. You allow the South to not have to go through the same journey that we've gone through in the North, which is a 100-year journey to get to the energy system we have today. They have to start where we are today and move forward. Now, what are we doing? We are committed to the energy transition under the umbrella of the key word is and, meaning we have to continue to produce and supply energy today, and we have to lay the framework and the groundwork to transition to the energy system of the future. That energy system of the future will include things like carbon capture, like biofuels, like hydrogen, like lithium. There is no pathway that doesn't go through those four. We choose to work on things where we have capabilities because, again, what you summarized was, wow, the scale of this challenge, the breadth of this challenge, and so you focus on what you can do. You focus on where you have capabilities, you focus on where you can start implementing solutions, recognizing that there will be a disbalance early, but as you go through the transition, that balance will change. So the charter talks about that. The charter talks about set achievable near-term targets. It talks about longer-term targets. It talks about technology transfer, best practice. It talks about how you actually report. It has all of the elements that are needed, and that's why we're big supporters of it and why we wanted to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for this terrific answer. And I do want to come back to how we're going to rebuild or build trust in that companies are actually going to follow through and potentially break down the dichotomy. But I want to go to you, Allison. Obviously, as an oil and gas field service company, Baker Hughes is really committed, and you have this beautiful pavilion just across the hallway from here to progressing climate solutions. So where are we? What's the demand from the industry for your solutions?
So where we're at today is I would say during the pandemic, you saw companies retrenching a little bit and thinking, and then the economy went in another direction where things have been a bit stressed, right? There's a lot happening in the world. And what I've observed, because I sit in a place, the title of sustainability officer is a bit misleading, right? Because there's an old way of thinking about what that is. But what we end up doing is sitting down with customers to say, like, what is your real issue here, and what do you want to focus on first, right? And so the focus, I would say thus far, is people are thinking about where they want to invest money. And so that's part of it, is sort of feeling out where to invest, which Exxon's been pretty straightforward in how they're approaching their investments. But then where the rubber meets the road on actually thinking about abatement today, that's where it gets a little bit harder. I mean, sitting right in front of me is the leader of our emissions management growth area, and she's just walked into that, and we've really seen interest, but not as much spend yet, okay? Because if you're fiscally tight and you're thinking about how to weather a certain storm of economic turmoil, this is not exactly the first place where people are spending yet. That said, I see companies just like ours focused on efficiency as the first mainstay. And so when we think about it as a company, our core business isn't just oil field service and equipment. I just want to point that out. We actually produce industrial energy technology that goes into heavy industrials and power gen. And so there's a lot that happens on that efficiency side as well, okay? And so we're getting a bit more, but we're in the ramp up now on the activity, and I think it's still going to be a little bit. The policy signals are being set today that will push more people to get to the point where they'll really have deep action. I would note, I've seen a really notable difference with companies that I sit down with where it was that we were talking about, like, where should we start on our abatement journey, okay? And because of the EU CSRD that came out, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, more people are worried about compliance on how to report right now, and there's less spend that I observe on the actual solution itself. And I do think that that's a problem, all right? And so we're gonna have to balance reporting and regulations that just force transparency versus actual action.
And can I just ask a follow-up question? Do you think the oil and gas charter is a good first step towards these criteria that you just outlined?
I think it is. We were in most of the discussion for the oil and gas charter. It's worth noting, while it's IOCs and NOCs in the charter itself, there's a whole ecosystem of Clean Air Task Force, Baker Hughes, and other organizations that were in making sure that all of the great collective interests and enablement were at the table for that. So we think it's a really great step. Never have we seen this amount of, I mean, like someone said to me yesterday, well, isn't it kind of disingenuous? These companies already pledged to do this. And I are very respectfully said, actually, OGCI has been trying pretty hard to do this. And with the charter, we've now seen almost a tripling of the number of companies that are coming in and going, like saying they're going to get to net zero. And it is very much worth noting, having national oil companies come in, they have a real unique challenge that I don't think most people appreciate. A big part of a national oil company's mission is to produce revenue for the government programs. So by saying we need to keep up production but low carbon at the same time, it's a really difficult thing to do both. It's almost like it's disincentivized, because do you really want to take away GDP from a country's economy that might pay for that health care on Health Day, since that's the theme? You don't. So the fact that they're in the charter is amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Adam, I want to go over to you because we've been working together on policy signals, right? Incentives, as Allison has just talked about. So what are some policy options for near-term action, and what if we're thinking about the solution set? There's some solutions like methane mitigation where we have the technology, so we can do that faster, say, than others. Maybe you can give us just an overview of the solution set and where we are, so we're not just lumping them all together as if they're all ready to go.
Right, solution sets. Firstly, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to GDA Connect and the Atlantic Council. It's great to be here. Before we get to that, I just want to react quickly to some of the people here who said eliminating or banning fossil fuels might be a reasonable idea. I want to come back to, I think, some of the things that Majid, Vijay, and Allison has already said. It's all of the good stuff has been used up already. We need a framework to think about this. The problem is emissions and greenhouse gases, whether it's emissions of methane flaring or directly into the atmosphere, or emissions of carbon dioxide now. We used to have a problem with emissions of sulfur dioxide. We worked on that issue. The framework that I like to think about is one that CAPSARC has been very active in trying to help people understand how to deal things. It's the 4 R's of reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. So if you think about carbon dioxide, reduce it, efficiency, or renewables like solar and wind, or hydrogen as a alternative fuel. Recycle and reuse, I think everybody understands that from the way we try to recycle things in the physical world. We're going to hopefully do the same thing with carbon dioxide. And finally, remove. Even if we could end all of the emissions or stop using fossil fuels today, there's still too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we'll have to find ways to take that out, either biological solutions, nature-based solutions, oceans, forests, mangrove restorations, that kind of thing, or removing it. And there's right here next to us is a direct air capture idea. And this is going to be really important to keep all of those pathways that Vijay said, keep them open. There's still too many people where populations are growing and incomes are growing and they don't have energy. They're going to want energy. So we need practical solutions that we can start to put in place now. So then that comes back to the solutions issue that you talked about, and policy. So you need technology. We need to find ways to promote technology. We need to find ways to have lots of demonstration and pilot projects all over the world. Those are probably going to require government help. The policies, Lee, that would drive that would include things like enabling those new technologies to be put in place. It's not going to be easy because they're somewhat expensive at this point. Hopefully we drive the cost down over time, and there's ways to do that. And we need measurement, reporting, and verification systems so that we all are on the same page of understanding how the quantity of emissions that we're removing and the validity of doing that. Final comment, in doing all this, we need market solutions. We need market solutions that'll drive this out of it needs government support into it's a commonplace thing that you can buy and sell like anything else. One of the ways that we're going to do that is by scaling up, having hubs, carbon dioxide hubs and hydrogen hubs. It's something that the UAE is working on, Saudi Arabia is working on, the United States is doing it under the IRA legislation. Eventually, we want to use what we learn in doing all of that to actually turn these emissions of carbon dioxide that we don't want into a valuable product that you can sell to people that has the bad qualities, that temperature raising quality locked up forever. And I think it can be done. I'm optimistic about it.
Thank you, Adam. Vamsi, I want to go to you with, also inspired by you, Vijay. Are we asking the right questions, right? As a financial institutions, you're being confronted with calls of divestment from assets versus investment in asset transformation. Now, especially investment in asset transformation with next generation technologies that Adam just talked about isn't always feasible or in the realm of risk that financial institutions are willing to take. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of how you're grappling with this dichotomy in the financial sector, but also what tools you're using to really evaluate what's the right level of investment to still, in an attempt to at least align with net zero targets.
Yep, thank you. Again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Again, as one might imagine, JP Morgan is a big global bank, and the reason sort of I'm sitting in this panel with the rest of the oil and gas sort of sector is we look at our own scope 3 financed emissions, right? So we're lending to the sector. We are helping companies underwrite equity and bonds. So we take our role seriously in how that impacts the emissions in the global world, right? So we look at the energy transition both from a quote-unquote risk perspective and from an opportunity perspective. From a risk perspective, we have emission intensity reduction targets on both the supply side of the equation and demand side of the equation, which is again a point that the panel here is making. We cannot just have a singular focus on cutting fossil supply, right? That is not going to realistically get us anywhere. We have to focus on every individual demand sector. Again, in addition to looking at the energy mix, every individual demand sector and looking at what the key levers are, what are the challenges in decarbonizing each of those sectors, and are we having the right policies in place for that? So in that end, JP Morgan has sort of two targets on the supply side. One for oil and gas scope 1 and 2, which again we talk about reducing methane emissions, reducing flaring, increasing the operational efficiencies. So we were actually very pleased this week to see the increase in commitment of the sector. This is we've actually put out a position paper last week a couple of weeks ago on the methane opportunities. We actually position it as a triple win, which is reducing methane emissions is good for climate, it's good for energy security, it's good for the business. So we have this is very differentiating. We have a very important focus on scope 1 and 2. People tend to commingle the scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 issues of oil and gas, and then the scope 1 and 2 issues doesn't get the right spotlight in our opinion. So we have a very, very specific view on that. Then coming to the scope 3 of the oil and gas sector, again, we have a more holistic view on looking at the energy mix combined, right? So it's not just about asking for production cuts, but how do we see the mix between the fossil fuel and renewables evolve? So when we set our target, we basically talk to the companies in the energy sector along 4 levers. The first is, again, moving from oil to gas, as the keynote speaker had alluded, moving from coal to gas is reducing a lot of emissions in the power generation sector, right? So moving from oil to gas reduces the intensity of the sector. Then producing more biofuels. There is a lot of need for sustainable aviation fuel in the aviation sector to decarbonize. There's need for renewable diesel in the trucking to decarbonize, right? So building out biofuels is important. Then building out carbon capture. I think any realistic net zero by 2050 scenario is going to rely on negative emissions. And in a way, who knows the sector better than oil and gas companies? And they know how to take carbon out of the ground. They also are engineers and know how to put carbon back in the ground, right? So focusing on that. And then the last thing is helping build out renewables, again, whether by the oil and gas sector or more broadly. Again, very heartening to see the tripling of the renewables pledge this week. And we really need, our strategy is that we need to build out the renewable energy capacity while the need for fossil fuel sort of goes down in the coming sort of decades.
Great, thank you. And I want to, after this first round of remarks, I want to go back to you, Vijay, with a little bit of a harder question. We've heard, Adam, you've laid out a vision for what kind of technologies are needed. Particularly, methane mitigation is feasible at scale today. Carbon capture and storage still needs to be deployed at scale. Same with hydrogen, for example, which we also mentioned. But Ellison, you said there's huge interest in the solutions, but not a lot of spent. And I want to read from an IEA report that for the moment, the oil and gas industry as a whole is a marginal force in the world's transition to a clean energy system. So that's a hard question, Vijay. You're Exxon, right? The face of the industry when it comes to responsibility, I would say. How would you respond to this? Do you feel like, what are your plans? And do you feel like your plans are being understood and fairly examined?
Yeah, so first, let's have the hard questions. this is a hard topic. And I don't think we want soft questions. I think we want the hard questions. And then we want the conversation around the hard questions, so we don't think a hard question can get a 3-second soft answer. So let's talk about this hard question. And let's talk about the one word that hasn't been used yet. A lot of words have been used. Wow, right? The word that hasn't been used is scale. This is a scale that is unimaginable, right? Most people don't know what an exajoule is. You guys know what an exajoule is? You guys know what a terawatt is? This is like, we're talking 10 to the 15th powers, 10 to the 18th powers, okay? So whenever you compare something at scale to something at not scale, you can get a disproportionate answer. It comes back to what question are you answering? And the question that has to be answered is, are you taking steps to catalyze and drive the transition? To that, I say yes, okay? You have to be doing things, right? So what do we know? We know that as you get on a deployment, the key is to get on a deployment curve. So the reason why you said we have methane now and we can do things with methane is because we've been on that deployment curve for a long time. Because you want to mitigate methane emissions. Now you want to get on a carbon capture pathway, you want to get on a hydrogen pathway, you have to get on the pathway to scale. Now the IRA, to your point, right, policy can help enable the first round of deployments. And we've seen that over and over and over again. But it isn't enough to get you to the scales that are needed. And so eventually the markets have to start to form as well. So look, a lot of comments are made out there around the disproportionality of the scale. But it's a disproportionality in time as well. You have a system that's taken 100 years to build. You have a new system that's just beginning to build. And so the key really is judge us, judge others on the steps that we're taking, on the clarity by which we're describing what we're doing. I really appreciate you guys saying that what I said made sense and was understandable. Because that's what we got to do. We got to take these hard questions and we got to answer them in simple, understandable terms, and then we got to prove it. So we're advancing projects in CCS, I think more than anybody else. 5 million tons of capture. Now I get it, 5 million tons is not gigatons, but it's 5 million tons of 3 different sources of CO2. So we're getting on multiple deployment curves at once. We're building a hydrogen project that could be up to 10% of the US target for hydrogen in one step. We're looking at new technologies to get lithium extraction. So the point is we're doing all that while we're recognizing one other thing that wasn't mentioned is this is a replenishment industry. Energy is kind of simple. You find it, you convert it, you use it. And then you got to go find it again. And so we've got to keep replenishing the base industry while we're going and transitioning. So all of that has to come together. The IEA comments are fine, and I think it's good to drive the discussion. But I think these meetings are critical to drive the pragmatic discussion, which is what's really needed if we're going to do this energy transition. So thank you for the hard question. Keep them coming.
Well, I think, next time maybe bring some numbers so we can, you got numbers?
Sure, what numbers do you want? I gave you 5 million tons of carbon capture. I gave you 1 million tons of hydrogen production. I gave you $17 billion of investments. I gave you lithium extraction that can ultimately get into millions of tons. We talk about a Denbury acquisition and a pipeline, which is the largest ability to move CO2. We got numbers. I don't like to turn these things into just a numbers infomercial thing. I want to talk about solutions broader because you all want to know what you can do. The discussion here is to talk about what we can do together, not what one company is doing. So let's have the discussion. But we got the numbers. We can have a numbers discussion if we want.
And are the projects at FID?
So again, right, are on the process to get to FID. The acquisitions are in the process of being acquired, okay? So it's all in the public domain. We can read it. But the point is these are all early stages, and these are all first steps. And the winning technologies are to be determined. But you've got to, I started a long time ago. I started in '87. I don't know when you started. I started a long time ago. If somebody would have given me a blank sheet of paper in '87 and said, how are you going to do energy in 2022? I'd have failed that exam. So we've got to get technology. This is a technology issue at the core. We got to get the right technologies deployed. We need a broad range of technologies because, again, one last comment, just to answer your question, numbers. The IEA also did a study on how are we doing in terms of deploying technology, and they found that 55 out of 57 are behind track. And that's actually a simplistic view because this is a regional solution set. You can't take the same technology ever. So the scale is both magnitude, size, and spatial, geography. And we've got to think about both of those. I really do appreciate the questions. I don't want to sort of dominate the discussion here, though, because we need to be talking about how we all work together to drive supply up and emissions down, because that's what we need to do.
Great. I think, you summarized it pretty well. First steps, right? Well, you were put under pressure to put in place or deliver on a vision that is, 104 million barrels a day away, essentially, in 2024. Right, we're really at the first steps, and I think, Allison, I want to go back to you because that's what you articulated so well in your opening comments.
So I wanted to clarify the spend piece. Okay, so what we're talking about up here is what in our company we call Horizon 2 and 3, so it's out a few years. We're still developing a lot of the projects, getting things to FID, et cetera. But I don't want you to think for a minute that people aren't spending money on the basics. Or, in fact, it's not about the spending of the money, it's about saving money. Okay, so I'm going to flip this around. So I'll give you an example of what I see from, because we get together a lot of like practitioners of actually doing the abatement part of it. And so I'll start with my company and then tell you what I see in the other companies. We have a very unique program at Baker Hughes, and it's called Carbon Out. And the intention of it is every single person in the company has power of spotting the inefficiency in emissions and coming up with a solution, okay? And so as of today, and note, we set our emissions reduction goal in 2019. We've reduced our emissions by 28%. We don't use offsets, we don't use power purchase agreements. We do it the hard way, which is refining our business from the core basic operations. If every single company on the planet did that, we would have a lot less emissions, right? Because that's really the problem. And so what does that mean on the ground? Because you wanted some numbers. We have executed, since we started this part of the program 2 years ago, 535 projects in 34 countries. Okay? Think about that. I want to say it again. 535 capital-intensive projects that we put in a very responsible business manner so that we would not really put an overburden on CapEx and also lower our OpEx. So as business leaders, sustainability and emissions reductions is actually excellent for business. We are a better running machine today, and we're just getting started. So that's where people are focused today, okay? So that's energy efficiency. That's about us thinking, now when we go and we work with Exon, okay, because they're one of our major customers, we look at how we operate with them in a field setting, or how we work with them in an industrial process with existing technology, and we're working to transform that existing core set that's today, while they get their chance to actually get to the bigger spend for the really sexy things like hydrogen and CCS, okay? So let us not ignore the fact that companies are doing this. It's just less headline driving, okay? But let's make the headline today, like we've managed to reduce our emissions globally by 28% by driving it across many countries in the world, okay?
Thank you. So first steps, I think we want to carve out what the next steps are, right? We have first movers, pioneers. So I want to go to Adam and Vamsi and get your take on what are the next steps from a policy for you, Adam, and from a financial perspective to unlock investment into the next steps are really bringing it. I think you articulated well. Scale matters, right? 3 or 4 or 200 carbon capture products are not gonna cut it. It has to be at gigaton scale. So Adam, maybe you get started, and then we'll go to Vamsi.
Sure. First of all, I think that the people who kind of look at the global situation with climate change and say, let's stop using fossil fuels, are expressing a frustration, Lee, with we've been talking about this for how many years and not making a lot of progress. I want to try to be optimistic in saying I think we're actually on the verge now of getting on a track that will begin to address the problem. And it comes back to your policy question earlier. What do we need to do is we need a broad set of government policies, all options on the tables. Try to do everything that you can. Anything that helps reduce the level of greenhouse gases is good. Nuclear is an option that will provide energy without creating a great deal of greenhouse gases. That should be a viable solution for those countries that want to pursue it, just as an example. So we need governments globally to create the enabling policies that allow the low carbon technologies and decarbonization technologies to move forward. And I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all answer. We're not going to get there by picking one pathway. I think we need multiple avenues, broad avenues of approaches, because the problem is very big. It does require scale. And then we can kind of come back to, you know, what is the role that the oil and gas industry itself can play in this? Is they have the engineering skills, they have the financing, financial capabilities, and the size to actually drive some of these solutions that we're looking for.
Thank you, Adam.
So to piggyback off of the policy discussion here, look, what we've seen as an example in the US, right? So between the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, again, that was probably the single biggest investment the country had made in the transition space. Again, why does JP Morgan care about that? We obviously are a big balance sheet bank, and the energy transition is going to need humongous amounts of capital, right? So amounts vary, but people talk about anywhere from $4 to $6 trillion annually being spent in getting the system to net zero by 2050. Again, once we go beyond like certain hundreds of billions, I know trillions don't, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Just to put that in context, right? Around this $5 trillion is twice the capex all the global large and mid-cap firms spend in any given year, or about twice the free cash flow that all the global large and mid-cap firms spend every year, right? So to the point made here, this is massive. It's not, scale is not the right word. Massive scale, right? Unprecedented. We have not seen anything like this happen, both at the scale and the pace that we are demanding. And we should all keep that in mind as we think about that. And I think the policy point is very important. Government needs to provide the right enabling framework and support to make this happen. And what we are seeing as a bank is once you have the right policies in place, like for example, the US case, we're seeing a lot of like discussion around hydrogen projects in the US, right? So there's tremendous amount of subsidy for that. The carbon capture projects, like where we did a number of deals this year in carbon capture, including the one Exon was talking about. And then, again, renewable build out, the US has around 30% investment tax credit, right? So that's causing a lot of like solar and wind build out there. So we are playing a role in a way that we look at all the mature technologies and see how can a bank like lend or provide capital. And then we look at emerging technologies and see how can we sort of like facilitate capital to all those things. Even in the context of methane, we're actually seeing a number of new companies in the modeling and measurement coming up, right? So there's several satellite measurement companies, airplanes, drones, data analytics, all of that. And it's a nascent industry, but an emerging industry. To solve that problem, banks need to help them raise capital and get them off the ground, right? So we are looking at solutions at both ends of the spectrum, scaling what's already like there, and also sort of like figuring out how do we get newer emerging quote-unquote riskier stuff off the ground.
Thank you very much. And we have just a few minutes left here with this panel, so I wanted to ask if there are any questions from the audience or comments. Not so many at once, please. All right, we'll have another question, a lightning round. 3 words or less, or 30 words or less, or something like that. Never works with 3 words, but we framed up the important next steps. So from your organization's perspectives, what does the sector need to, or what's the most important contribution from governments or stakeholders or financial institutions, depending on your perspective? What does the sector need to make the next steps? Allison, we'll start with you. Okay, well, there's a request to start with you, Vamsi.
So from our side, again, like I said, the relentless focus on increasing the efficiency or reducing the emissions associated with scope 1 and 2 has to be front and center. That's one. And two, I get that there is a very interesting debate happening on whether oil and gas companies should also develop like renewables or be in the business of electrons. But keeping that aside, clearly oil and gas companies have a huge role to play in the decarbonization of the molecules itself, right? Like, so them building out biofuels, hydrogen, carbon capture, and I think there has to be a strong focus on doing that and helping all of us get to net zero as quickly as possible.
Well, it won't be 3 words, but Majid start off by mentioning the success on getting an agreement on loss and damage funds and beginning that process. I think one of the other things that's going to happen, I hope here at COP28, is further progress on Article 6 and the ability to trade carbon. I think this is going to be really important, and that brings me back to measurement, reporting, and verification. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and Article 6 will help that process of how we get an agreement on the quantification of the issue, and that then allows these steps that we all want to happen to take place. And we will have a way of understanding that it is actually being addressed.
So I would look at it this way. There's 3 things that have to work together if we want to get this to happen: policy, technology, and infrastructure. And at the regional level. So there's not a singular solution. Policy then leads to markets. Technology leads to scale. Infrastructure is how you break the divide because you can move solutions around. So we've got to do that. I agree. Like, you mentioned something that's critical. We need carbon accounting. We need the ability to accurately reflect the emissions of one pathway versus another pathway with thermodynamic principles, meaning no double counting. You can only count the emission once. Now you can actually finitely add to a number, and you can start to understand where you're going. So this is an all of the above. Rarely in life is the answer all of the above. Here it is all of the above. It is unprecedented scale. And it is if you want to accelerate this, it is through collaboration. So we have to change the way we collaborate. Thank you for hosting the panel.
The wrap up, I felt bad because the guys at the end were always having to talk last. So now I can reflect on what they said. I'd say the one thing that wasn't covered is that we've got to be deliberate about how we think about workforce as we're going. That has been a pinch point so far, and I can say that both seeing it from the fungibility and like how people are hopping around a lot who have expertise, because there's a really big supply chain problem with the skill set right now. And so particularly with your comments is if we don't really think hard about what we're doing to set up the workforce of now and tomorrow, then we really will kind of fall flat on the expectation, because you have to have people, because we'll have this sort of phase out of one kind of skill set and another one might come online. So communities get left behind and then we just don't have enough people. So we really, really should think about that aspect of it as we're here at COP.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to thank this fantastic panel for their insights, for their honest insights. I do want to reflect also, together with our keynote remarks earlier that we heard, I think framing matters, asking the right question matters, and looking at some of the fault lines, I think we've heard there's regional perspective. Not each country or region will require the same set of solutions. So there's a huge question about the legitimacy on imposing a solutions frame. The same for timelines. I think, Majid, you made it really clear that not everyone's starting from the same baseline in terms of the energy system and energy access and development. And so there is a huge question whether everyone can be put on the same timeline from a global decarbonization perspective. And then the framing of the climate problem needs to be grounded in scale. I think we heard massive scale as an infrastructure problem and within the nexus of energy security and economic security, which I think in some places, particularly Western Europe, often was not center of the conversation until the global energy crisis last year. And so, I mean, where do we go from here, right? I think we've grounded or agreed that we're at early stages, at first steps. So the oil and gas charter comes at a really defining moment. It lays the pathway. I think what we want to see as an environmental or climate organization is to carry this forward. So we're not just going to COP29, wherever it will be, or COP30, and we don't know how we're going to measure progress. But I also think that it gives governments a clear mandate from 40% of global production to put in place a regulatory and policy environment to progress solutions. So I think the call from us to the companies is show that it can be done, show that it can be done responsibly, safely with the consent of local communities, and all while you're still serving energy needs globally. So I think we'll stop here. There's huge questions and new panels. For example, electricity versus molecule decarbonization, which often gets confused. So, encouraging all of us to reconvene for the next conversations. And with this, thank you to the Atlantic Council. I would just like to invite you to our next panel here, which will start in 15 minutes, Laying Net Zero's Groundwork, Energy Corridors for the Future. Thanks all for joining us, and we'll see you soon.